Good evening from Israel. This is Jonathan Feldstein. Happy Passover to all of our, I was going to say all of our Jewish friends, but we know that there are many Christian friends who are celebrating alongside with us. And in fact, we'll speak about that at the end of the program. That will be our last webinar tomorrow evening as the conclusion of our week-long global Passover prayer for Israel. For those of you who don't know me, Jonathan Feldstein, I'm the privilege of being the president of the Genesis 123 Foundation. And we are the hosts today of this incredible program, which is the third of four in this particular series and the fourth, in fact, of our global prayers for Israel that we've been privileged to host in the past year. The purpose of the Genesis 123 Foundation is to build bridges between Jews and Christians with Israel in ways that are new and unique and meaningful. And we've done that in many ways, and I don't mean for this to be a specific commercial for the various programs. Certainly, I invite everyone to visit our website, genesis123.co, and you'll learn about the various programs that we host, and including our the Run for Zion, unfortunately, that was canceled last year due to the pandemic, the first Christian-oriented program here in Jerusalem about running around the Jerusalem Marathon, a program called Verses for Zion for Christian children to study verses in the Bible related to Israel so that they internalize and understand not just that Israel exists and there's a general belief that Israel is important, but there's an actual understanding of why. And we do so as Jews and Christians from mutual respect, but from our respective traditions. And we don't always understand or agree upon one another, on things with one another, but that's why we have these conversations, to learn and to build those bridges. I'd like to ask everybody, I hope that we're streaming on Facebook. I'd like to ask everybody watching, if you have questions, please use the chat. We're going to try and keep microphones muted unless you're speaking. And we want to try and avoid any distractions from the video itself. So if there's anything going on in the background where you are and we see you, just please be mindful of that. Now, I realize before we begin the program per se, and I introduce our guests, our friends, I realize that for some people watching this, there needs to be a little bit of a background, because we're going to be discussing not just personal stories, but concepts that even only a generation or two later that are very difficult for people who are free in the West, or even I know some people are following from Africa, difficult for people to understand. So we received some questions before, and one of them was very, very interesting to me because it asked how many, what was the question? How many Jews were released prior to the fall of the Soviet Union? So the short answer, depending on what year we divide, through the 1970s, from the late 60s through the 70s, about 250,000 Jews. That peaked in 1979, and then it began to drop off again in the 1980s until the late 80s when the miracles of glasnost and perestroika were brought in by Comrade Gorbachev, and Jews were able to leave en masse, and then ultimately the Soviet Union fell apart. All of, and by the way, and from that point, more than 1.5 million Jews or people of Jewish descent have been able to leave the Soviet Union, most of whom have come to Israel, which is wonderful here for us in our country, and certainly for our friends who are with us. And I'm sharing this as background because there's so much history, and I think that we may go over concepts tonight, and I may interject if I think that some of our viewers don't really understand some of the concepts that our guests are speaking about. But in short, why we're having this conversation is that in pre-Soviet Russia, and certainly in the Soviet Union, Jews were widely discriminated against and persecuted. We all know from the movie Fiddler on the Roof how Jews suffered pogroms 120, 130, 150 years ago. And there were some pretty horrible pogroms in the Soviet Union. that became a state-sponsored form of anti-Semitism and discrimination. We're going to speak about that, but these are hard concepts to understand in 2021, a generation after, a generation and a half after all of our guests here tonight left the Soviet Union. I want to acknowledge particularly two people who are watching and joining, and I hope that we'll have an opportunity to say hi. Glenn Richter in New York, who's sort of like the, if not the father, one of the fathers of the Soviet Jewry movement, who helped brief me and prepare me for my first trip to the Soviet Union in 1985, and for so many years led the student struggle for Soviet Jewry, which was so impactful. Frank, I saw you. Enid, I believe you're joining us. Frank Brodsky in Philadelphia, Enid here in Jerusalem, and others. And I don't want to, I hate naming people because I always am afraid I'm leaving somebody out. There were many, many people like us, leaders like Glenn, and students like myself, and housewives like Enid, who were critically involved on our side of the Iron Curtain. Now, what I'd like to do is take a few minutes, and I'm going to be a little more formal than I normally am, only because we have 4 guests, and I don't want to miss anything. Just like to introduce everybody so we know who we're speaking with, and then we're going to go through a series of questions. And as I explained before, kind of having a dialogue among friends, to which we're inviting hundreds of people to join. So first, I'd like to introduce Ira Dashevsky. Ira was born in Odessa and moved to Moscow as a child. She made Aliyah with her family, including her husband and 4 children, in 1987, after an 8-year struggle as a refusnik to make Aliyah. Ira is a graduate of the Mandela Institute for Educational Leadership and is one of the founding members and chairperson of Machanayim, a program that creates new cross-cultural language, bridging the Russian and Jewish Israeli cultures together. Since 1990, this is very impressive, Machanayim has run Jewish academic courses in Russian for thousands of students in Bar Ilan University, authored over 30 books, and provided different educational and cultural programs, including over 15,000 families. Ira also works with the Ministry of Education as the head of the Jewish Tradition and Jewish Classical Texts teaching in the Hefziba program, which is a program that operates in 46 Jewish schools in the former Soviet Union. I don't know if we have time tonight, but I'm very interested. I'd love to learn more about that. Ira holds a master's in physics and education and is currently working on educational strategy for Jewish and a non-Jewish audience inspired by biblical values and ideas. So this is fascinating, Ira. We're so thrilled for you to be joining us today and grateful.
Thank you.
Ephraim Cholmiansky is a former Jewish activist, well, still a Jewish activist, but a former prisoner of Zion, one of the Jews imprisoned on trumped-up charges that were meant to punish and prevent their work in promoting Jewish life and advocating for the rights of Jews to leave the Soviet Union. He was an initiator and leader of the biggest underground project disseminating Hebrew and Jewish cultural activities in peripheral cities of the Soviet Union. Ephraim was born in Moscow in 1950 and made Aliyah in 1988 with his wife and I think then just 1 child. He is a computer engineer by training and presently involved in a startup company as the business manager. He's married, has 5 children today and 4 granddaughters. Ephraim has published a book called The Voice of Silence, the story of the Jewish underground in the USSR, about his experiences. It was first published in Russian in 2007, then translated to Hebrew in 2015. And Ephraim, we're very much looking forward to the English translation coming out later this year. And just by personal disclosure, this is a lovely reunion, which I thank Enid for. Ephraim and I visited in his apartment in Moscow in the fall of 1987 and was able to share some pictures of him and his then baby daughter. And I think we had the privilege, if I'm not mistaken, Ephraim, of meeting between when you were released from prison and then making Aliyah in the following year. David Schwartzman is here with us. looking pensively with his hand on his chin. I also met David in 1987 in Moscow when he was a 21-year-old student. David was active. I'm glad you reminded me of this, David. He was active then in what was called the second generation refusnik movement. These were the children, the adult children of Soviet Jews who were prohibited from leaving and who on their own applied for and became activists for the right of leaving the Soviet Union. This is already after he and his family had been refused permission to leave the Soviet Union for 15 years. A year after I visited with David and his wife Anna in Jerusalem, they were able to make Aliyah with their oldest son. Today they have 4 children. Most of them are grown and out of the house, including 2 married sons, an officer in the IDF, and the youngest who just celebrated his bar mitzvah last year. David works for many years in various high-tech industries, specifically mobile communications and internet. And also on a personal note, I mean, I remember meeting David. I remember both of our meetings, Ephraim and David, but so vividly in the fall of 1987. And that last time we were together on Simchat Torah at the synagogue in Moscow. I've been very grateful that we've stayed close friends. We happen to share the same birthday. But interestingly enough, when we met David, it took me a little while, but I realized I had read about him previously, which was my introduction to the Soviet Jewry movement in 1982. My mother read me an article in Hadassah magazine describing David and his bar mitzvah and the things that he was doing there. And after we met, I put the dots together. We've been close friends since. And a few years ago at my daughter's wedding, I looked around the room when we were able to have hundreds of people together. And I looked and I said to David and his wife, Anna, I said, except for my immediate family, you're the people in the room who know me the longest. So that's a real privilege, David. It's great to have you. Lisa Wasserman-Slutsky is also with us. Lisa was born in Leningrad to a family of Jewish activists and refuseniks on both sides of her family. Growing up, that was her identity. Her father taught Judaism and Torah in the USSR, and her mother and stepfather were also active refuseniks. She made Aliyah in 1987 at the age of 12. Today, she is in Jerusalem, has 3 daughters, 2 who are in the army and 1 who's in high school. And Lisa teaches history and civics at the Hartman High School for Girls in Jerusalem. So friends, these are our friends today. And I'm excited to get into a dialogue together. I think we'll try and go in some kind of order and maybe alphabetically, like I just introduced you. For those who are watching, perhaps you can just share for a moment what it was like your Jewish identity as a child. How did you feel persecuted if you were born into or you came into a refusnik family at an early age in life? What was that like? Being persecuted? Did you know your identity? Did you know you were Jewish? Did you know your family had applied to leave? And what did that mean? Ira, I see you've unmuted yourself alphabetically. Would you jump into that?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so good evening for everybody. I'm very happy to be here today, and I was born into an almost completely assimilated Jewish family. Both of my parents graduated with honors from Odessa University in Ukraine, but due to anti-Semitism, they couldn't find a job in Ukraine and were forced to move to Russia. That's why at the age of 3, I found myself near the city of Moscow. From the very beginning, I knew that it was necessary to fight back anti-Semitism. I knew that we were living in an awful regime. From the age of 3, I knew that what I hear at home under no circumstances should be repeated outside the home, because it was very, very dangerous for my parents. But the deeper understanding of what does it mean for me to be Jewish come later. And my parents didn't think about refusal about Israel at that time at all.
When did they first apply to leave the Soviet Union?
Okay, my parents divorced, and my father began really, he was kind of leader of some group of young people. Me and my friends, we were happy enough to be part of some Moscow math school where a lot of Jewish students and you know, people who were struggling for the free thinking people, they were part of this school. And we started to learn the Hebrew and Bible and Talmud and Jewish philosophy in a very young age. Actually, it was already beginning of future Mahanaim organization, which was opened much later in Israel. But our core group of these young people, which were led by my father, started in the late 70s, I would say. My father, Zeev Dashevsky, he has PhD in astrophysics, and today he's a president of Mahanaim. He was a promising young scientist who lost his career and work the moment he told his boss that he wanted to make Aliyah to Israel. It was 1977. And, you know, if you can imagine, maybe it's one of the most difficult point when you come to your boss and say that I am not what you think about me, what you've thought for many years about me. I want to leave this country and I want to make an aliyah to Israel. It's very, very difficult stage psychologically in the Soviet Union. And interesting, like, you know, I was a child yet. My father's story began with the 6-day war when his interest in the state of Israel increased very much. He was 30 years old, and I was an elementary school pupil that year. And when I returned one day from my school, I asked him if it was true that Israel was a terrorist state. And he got very, very angry with me. And I don't remember the story, but afterwards he told me that actually my question, the child question, made him ask himself what he really knows about Israel. And then he decided to make Aliyah in several years and decided to learn about Judaism, about Jewish philosophy, Bible, and so on. When I was 13 years old, I already decided to live after my father. It's very interesting that my father first heard Bible's word for the first time in his life from the lips of an American Christian who conducted a conversation on a radio wave band in the USSR in early 60s when my father was only 25 years old. And till this day, he remembers what it was about, Esau and Jacob, and he can tell us everything that he caught. It was in English. And 3 years later, he began himself to study general and Jewish philosophy and then to translate from English to Russian the books of Martin Buber.
Fascinating.
So that's how we started.
Great. Well, thank you for that. First, I just want to interject on 2 points. I don't think we are streaming yet on Facebook. There seems to be a problem. So those who are meant to watch, hopefully this will eventually make it. I also realized as I asked Ira the question about applying to leave, that's something that we also need to define. Today, except for a pandemic, you could pretty much get on an airplane and go anywhere you want in the world. And at the time, Jews in the Soviet Union or anyone in the Soviet Union needed a special permission to leave, and Jews were prohibited from doing so. You didn't just get on a plane even if you had the money. You had to have a special exit visa and taxes that were paid, and it was also all part of the discrimination. So I want to, all of our guests today have that same experience in different ways. So I just wanted to clarify that. Ephraim, would you jump in and tell us also in terms of your own Jewish identity as a child and the early identity and how you, if and how you felt persecuted at all or discriminated against?
Quite different. My parents didn't disclose to me that were Jewish. Wanted to shield me from this feeling. I knew about Jews only negative things. Heard that they are sinister, evil, greedy creatures, like a curse, like a chronic disease. So that's the way I started. Later, I got interested to find out the meaning of it. And the same mathematics school that Ira just described, I was privileged also to get enrolled. And it was half of my class was Jewish. And at the age of 16, we asked eternal questions. What's the meaning of your life? Why you came to this world? What will remain after you disappears from this world? And we just realized that the meaning of my life here isn't supposed to be to strengthen the Soviet Union, the country that regarded as sort of a natural resources like natural gas, coal, oil, that could be, should be exploited, produced for the benefit of the state and not for our benefit. And at the same time, we cannot lead the Jewish life. We cannot make Aliyah. No way, nothing. And it so happened that I wanted to share these dreams with my friends. It looked so funny for them, like, like to make a trip in time to go to the, say, Jewish sages of Talmud time, ask them questions. It's incredible. It's impossible, beyond our capabilities. That's the way I started.
When you were speaking in terms of being an adolescent and half of your class being Jewish, did others like you start to have these questions? And did you feel, and whether they did or didn't, were you uneasy having conversations with your friends in school about what you realized?
We had a smaller group of 4 friends. And we shared all kinds of ideas, bizarre questions were allowed. And one of these bizarre questions was the eternal hate for the Jews. And the question, if we're hated for hundreds of years, for millennia, what's the secret? What's the enigma of our survival? What we would use today as terms divine force. I didn't use it at that time, but my feeling was that there is some force above us that protects us. Otherwise, it cannot happen.
Which is sacrilegious in the Soviet Union. That very concept is sacrilegious.
No, it was not. Our drive was not religious at that time.
Oh, what I mean sacrilegious, it went the notion that there was a higher being, presumably God, is something that was fiercely opposed in the communist Soviet Union. Just to have that idea was something that was marking you as different and problematic.
It was all along with me. It was all along with me. But just speaking logically, if there is a small nation, small people that is persecuted, and there are mighty forces against it, it's supposed to disappear very soon from the history. And if it doesn't happen, that there should be the reason, that should be the cause for this unusual, truly incredible chain of events. But at the same time, sorry. What happened? But at the same time, we thought that the very existence of this protective force makes a certain meaning to us. So our lives became more meaningful if we take our proper place, if I came back to where I belong. That was my feeling.
Got it. Thank you. David, you and I spoke the other day a little bit, and you talked about, I don't want to jump too far ahead, but you were born essentially into a family of refuseniks. It was your identity, at least from a very young age. And you kind of embraced that in many ways. Explain what that was about. When I don't have the exact timeline, but share about that. But when we met, you were 21 years old and had already been active, not just self-identified as a Jew and an activist, but second generation. How did that come up in your childhood?
Right. Well, also I think you guys noted already that most of us were born in very assimilated family, meaning that our parents didn't know much about Jewish tradition, Jewish culture, nothing about Bible, Torah, nothing. And I was really a rather small boy when my parents decided to leave the Soviet Union. I was 7 years old, and I really knew nothing. And then my mom, and actually there was no too much sources to learn this. There was no books on Jewish history. There was no Bibles published in the Soviet Union. So my mom found a kind of book that was translated from Polish. I believe my former Russian friends remember Kasidovsky. They presented it like there are ancient Greek myths, the same way there are ancient Bible myths. Okay, but it was a myth. Okay, and my mom read me about Abraham, about Jacob, about Yitzhak, all the Bible stories that you guys know very well, and that's how I learned actually for me it was a Jewish history, but in general it was Bible. That's how that was my first discovery of Bible. Much later, when I was, I think, 10 or 11 years old, we found there is a word, samizdat, meaning that Jews reproduced the prohibited literature, which usually come from abroad, by themselves, by just photographing each page or even typing each page of it could be hundreds of pages. Okay, so there was a history of Jewish people written by Shimon Dubnov, and that's how I think first time I got my identity. And another interesting story that I remember, one of the stories from this Bible myths that impressed me most of all was the story of Samson of Shimshon. Jonathan, how is
Samson.
it pronounced?
Samson.
Samson. Okay, Samson. And in my class, class, there was a guy whose name was Samsonov. Okay, so and his nickname was Samson. So for me, it was, and he was really a leader, like a Samson in the Bible, right? And so I told this story, this Samson story, to the whole class. And this guy was pronounced to be a Samson. And then instead of playing in Russians and fascists, like everybody was playing that those days, good guys are Russians and bad guys are German fascists, German Nazis. Now there was Jews, Samson, and Plishtim. How you say Philistine? Philistine?
Philistines.
Philistines. Okay, Philistines were bad guys.
Amazing, amazing. Lisa, you started a little bit younger than David, right? You were born into a family of refuseniks. What was that? Did your parents, obviously they didn't protect you your whole time, but what was that like? And did you feel persecuted or discriminated against?
Right, as you said, I think I'm the youngest, and I'm not sure that I remember myself before growing up in a refusenik family, since my parents applied for a visa when I was 4 years old, and they got divorced shortly afterwards, and then they went on their separate paths. As you said, my father became religious, and he started out Zionist, but he went on more and more and on learning Torah and Jewish scripts, and then teaching. And my mother and her second husband, they were more active in cultural events, and then in their home there was underground theater and many meetings around Jewish holidays, and as I said, cultural events, and many meetings with people from abroad who came, Jewish and Christians. And actually, my stepfather is very much involved with a Christian embassy in Jerusalem.
Oh.
He made a film for them, and his name is Leonid Calvert, and he made like a few projects with them. They have many friends from there. And in my father's home, there was usually Hebrew classes and Torah classes and meetings and lectures. He was also active with the Jewish seminars that were set up by refuseniks in Leningrad, and he printed a lot of samizdat books and papers that David described. So I think I know from my parents and from my grandparents about our families beforehand, which were also, on my mother's side, the family was very assimilated, few generations actually already. They came from Lithuania to Leningrad, from Vilna, and they were secular, I think, already on the turn in the end of 19th century. And all the Lithuanian part perished in the Holocaust. I think there was also some religious family, but they were not in touch with the Leningrad part, and they were secular, and they didn't speak Yiddish. They spoke Russian in the family. I think already in my grandparents' family, and so my mom grew up knowing she is Jewish, but there was nothing actually to more to this identity than just knowing that she's Jewish and having a very, very Jewish last name, Kogan. So she was like marked, and with everything that came with it, with difficulty to be accepted to the university that she wanted, and then later on having problems to find work. And then she married my father, who was a Wasserman, also very Jewish, and it's great. But she only started discovering her Jewish identity when she met with the friends who had more Jewish identity, Zionist identity in the university, and then when she became close to refuseniks to be. And my grandparents went along. They supported her, and finally my grandmother also came with us to Israel, but they were not close to Judaism in any way beforehand. And my father's family, they were more, they culturally more Jewish. They spoke Yiddish between them, like my grandparents, but they were secular. They didn't have any Jewish holidays in their house for my father and his brother. They talked about themselves being Jewish and about tradition with the family, but they were not very they didn't practice Judaism. For example, my father told me that he knew that his grandparents went to have a Passover Seder at their relative's house, but they never took the children or the grandchildren with them. They didn't tell them about the Jewish tradition. So he grew up knowing nothing, even though he was very aware of his Jewishness and the Yiddish language at home.
So Lisa, let me interrupt you just a second. There's a nuance that someone who's not familiar with what you're talking about won't understand. The difference between families that were more and less assimilated, and one of the indications of that being whether they spoke Russian or Yiddish. So I just want to pause, and I'm not going to go into an explanation of that right now. But if there's anyone watching on this point or other points, please use the chat or connect with us afterward, because there's a lot of perspective that is needed to understand the picture fully. Lisa, what about you as a child? Fascinating family experience and the diversity. But I remember, for instance, when I was in my teens and 20s, and I adopted a family in Moscow, and they had 2 daughters. The youngest daughter didn't know for many years that the family was, they used their Russian, they were Russian according to the passport. She certainly didn't know they were refuseniks, that they had applied, much less been refused to leave, and the discrimination. How did you, from the age of 6 or 7 in first grade, all the way until 12 years old, these are really formative years, interact with children where it was very common in Soviet society to discriminate openly against Jews, even in the schools? Where did that play out?
Well, as Ira said, that I knew that I shouldn't talk about anything that was going on in the house, at school, or elsewhere, because there was a lot of underground activity also going on in my homes. And when I went to school at 6 years of age, I knew very well to make a totally separation. I had friends at school, but I usually wouldn't invite them home. And I knew that I was Jewish, and I knew I knew Jewish traditions and things about Judaism because I was being told about it at home, Bible stories, and I went to Purim spiels, like Purim festivals, at our friend's home, and we had Shabbat and Jewish holidays celebrated with many friends at our house. And I don't know exactly. And I asked my parents, and we had like whole conversation about whatever they ever told me not to say anything, or wherever they told me that I should not. Maybe it was only said once, and I understood it, or maybe it was so much built in. I don't know. I had 2 Jewish kids in my class when I was in school, and one was totally against speaking about anything Jewish. I know, not because I tried, but it came up. Another was from a Jewish family that talked about being Jewish, but not active in any way. And we didn't make any friendship between us, which is quite interesting, because it would be logical that we would be,
that would be logical,
the 3 of us together. But I had other friends at school. But I think I was quite an outsider because of this duality at my home. But I loved it, and I grew up actually with thinking that every day we will go to every tomorrow is a potential day of going to Israel, and it just went on for so many years. But not crazy to think about it now. But when we came here, I was a teenager, and I was very happy to come. It didn't make my absorption easier, but I was very enthusiastic about everything Israeli.
So that's another whole piece of a conversation. We'll have to have another time about. My oldest daughter was 11 when we made Aliyah, and coming here when you did at that age is a different conversation. But I wanna bump over to Ira. I think I saw you nodding your head. It's something that Lisa was saying. Was it relating to children? Yeah. What would you like to add to that?
Yeah, I agree with Lisa in different points. I meet Lisa for the first time this evening, and it's very nice to meet you, Lisa. But your father is so famous. We've read his translations of different classical texts into Russian from English, I think, when we were refuseniks and so on. And what about children? I had 4 children in Moscow, which is very, I would say it's kind of I had another 4 children in Israel. And I have to say it's much easier in Moscow to have 4 children when you are kosher and you eat only kosher food. And I didn't send my children to the kindergarten because of the Soviet ideology. So I raised all of them at home all these 8 years. And at the same time, I was engaged in our Jewish studies and our struggle. And, I couldn't not to be the part of the struggle, because it was kind of feeling that we have to prolong with this because of the Soviet ideology, which destroyed human rights and personality and dignity. It was kind of in a commandment to fight the evil empire and to prepare to be arrested. Fortunately, we didn't get to prison like Sasha Ephraim, who presents here, but many of our friends did. And I personally, officially, I couldn't work because I was a teacher by my education. And how can an enemy of the people teach Soviet children at school? So I couldn't work. And, there were 2 main groups in Moscow at that years. Our group, Mahanaim group, mainly taught Jewish philosophy and Bible and Talmud in underground. And I personally, one of my main occupations was to teach Jewish children in Jewish Sunday school underground. And, the KGB followed our activities and they persecuted us, came to our places of work and threatened to throw us out of our jobs. People lost their careers and so on and so on. And my husband, Mikhail, was forced to leave an interesting research job at Moscow State University because of our apply to live to Israel. Repeatedly, the KGB people broke into the apartments where the classes were held and copied the name of all those present to continue further persecutions. But spiritually, we couldn't, exist without these classes, without these lessons.
That's a great point. That's a great point that was your fuel. Ephraim, I want to come over to you. Iro just spoke about you and other friends who were imprisoned. When you and I met in 1987, you had a beautiful little baby. And I like to segue perhaps for speaking about what was that like? You were an activist, you had a brand new baby, you had just been released from prison. What's going through your head as a Jewish activist, beginning a family in the place that you want to leave?
It's no contradiction whatsoever. You know, I can try to describe the prison experience. It's a long story, but once you are released, you
the story
start.
will wait for the book. I want people to buy and read your book.
Okay. You sort of start a new lease of life. There's a mixture of feelings. It's still sort of a continuation in part of what you experienced in prison. You still feel that it could reach you. You're not isolated, you're not shielded, you're not protected fully. And the new family, the birth of the first daughter creates a bizarre feeling that that part of your life is over. It's a new release of life. They cannot come anymore to you.
So just having a baby wasn't even in and of itself liberating.
Yes, for
Wonderful.
sure.
Wonderful.
Sure.
Wonderful. One of you just spoke, I think it was you, Lisa, and David wasn't brought into the last round, spoke about your grandparents going to a Passover Seder, but not bringing the children. I'd like to, we're in the middle of Passover. A few nights ago, we all celebrated here our Seder. And there are many elements of the Seder, of course, but one of them is that we're supposed to experience the Seder as if we too left Egypt. If we were slaves and we left Egypt as well. And I believe it. I think that you all had that experience. You were enslaved in a different way. You weren't building pyramids, but you were part of this long legacy of persecution in the Soviet Union, being persecuted in the Soviet Union. And your liberation, honestly, was no less significant to us as a people. It just wasn't written about in the Bible. So I'd love to begin a bit of a conversation, and maybe David, starting with you, if you could talk about your first Passover experience. What did you remember? Did you feel like you were part of the story because you were where you were under those circumstances? And I'm curious, this is the question I want to ask all of you. Did the fact that God freed us from Egypt give you any kind of particular hope in your situation?
Well, first of all, the first Seder that I remember was, I think, when I was 13. It was in 1978, when a rabbi from the United States came to Moscow, and he made Seder in our apartment. And I mean, for me, it was absolutely amazing experience. I mean, every word that he said out of Agada, out of the Seder, out of the Seder book that Jews read during Passover, first Passover night, for me was like, wow. Whether I identified myself with this slavery and with Exodus in this first night, I'm not sure, but definitely when I became more grown up, became more mature, I guess maybe in my 16, 17, 18, for sure, each and every Seder, and at that time I led it by myself, with family and many friends. I identified myself, and the last sentence of the Seder is the next year in Jerusalem, right? And when you sit in Moscow and you say the next year in Jerusalem, you really, really mean it. And I think that the first Seder in Israel when I said the next year in Jerusalem, I thought to myself, wow, now I am in Jerusalem. It's like, it's amazing.
Thank you for sharing. I want to come to that experience here. Ira, I think you also unmuted yourself. Did you want to add something? I want everyone to answer the question, but you seemed like you wanted to jump in.
I just wanted to tell you that it was kind of miracle in the temple that there was enough space for everybody when when Jews came on Passover to the temple. So in our first Passover, I remember it was kind of like this miracle that in our small apartment there was enough room for many people who wanted to know what is it about. And it was very, very interesting that people came, you know, like David said, they knew nothing, but they were thirsty and wanted to know more and more about our faith.
And it's important to interject here, David, you, Ira, and I want to hear from Lisa and Ephraim as well. Just by having people in your home, Jewish people, whether it's for Seder or someone mentioned for Purim or Shabbat, you had neighbors who were reporting to the KGB, and the KGB was coming in. And this was not just a simple festival gathering. You were putting yourself, you stood up and said, no, Ad Khan, this is it. I'm resisting whatever threats, and we're going to. It's not to be taken for granted that any of you.
Jonathan, I would even add to it that the fact that you applied for exit visa in the USSR, it's a kind of declaration and of liberation. I mean, this was the first act for the Jews to liberate themselves. And when you host evenings like Seder or Purim or Shabbat, it was like maybe the second step, but the first one, you have already been liberated in your mind.
Mentally, sure. Lisa, you were also young, and this was part of your identity. I think you said before you don't really remember a pre-Refusnik time, so you celebrated Passover at some point. What was your first recollection of that, and how did that impact your identity, Passover in Leningrad?
Oh, well, I because of our talk tonight, I tried to remember what I remember especially about Pesach, and absurdly enough, it was not the holiday I remember most. And I tried to recollect whether I know for sure that I did participate with my parents. I went along to friends or families who had the Seder, because I think most of the time the more religious or our friends led the Seder and we joined, because really no, my parents felt, I think in the beginning, they didn't know anything about making a Seder. But later on, they also start leading their own Seders. And I think I'm not sure it had a special impact about the freedom more than any other things, because also the Hanukkah story about Jews having a victory over the Greeks and less against the many, and the Purim story about the miraculous miracles of survival. I think this was like the main story, but the Passover was just one more thing for me. And I know it kind of ruins your theory, but but it's true. I think everything about this activity in my view as being growing into it was having something special and heroic about my parents.
Sure.
And of course there was a KGB all the time present. I was used to coming back from school and saying whoever was home if there is a policeman outside or not, and usually there was, just every day. And every festival or every special event there was a car outside, or people trying to arrest the guests, or anything. And absurdly enough, I don't remember that Pesach was one of those times that they looked to harass us more than others.
Thank you. Okay, Ephraim, we would love to hear about you. I remember, I think when you and I were speaking, preparing for this, I mentioned something about I asked you something about your first Pesach experience, and I remember your face lit up. I'd love for you to share that, but I also have specifically, in thinking as everyone else is speaking, you also had the unique perspective in that you were involved in outlying cities in promoting Jewish activities. Did you travel and do holidays there? Or how did you transmit that in peripheral cities?
It was a grand underground project. When we heard the word underground many times tonight, have different meanings for our project and for whatever was conducted in Moscow and Leningrad. So it was what our ladies mentioned was somewhat an unofficial, maybe concealed sort of activity. But that project was really against the will of the KGB. They wanted to prevent it. And from the very beginning, it was a real underground. So basically, very few people knew about that in Moscow, only those who were directly involved. Even it was concealed from the close friends. So it was the entire organization that I initiated this project. And we sent people to organize events in different places. I myself traveled when there was nowhere to send. In terms of the Passover, the Seder, and the meaning, yes, it was a peculiar event for us. There were two sayings, famous sayings in the Seder. The first, "Let my people go," so resonant with our souls. But the second, "Next year in Jerusalem," was so detached, so remote, sort of a wishful thinking, the dream of the youth. To imagine that really could happen to us, you need some stretch of imagination. So I only conducted Seder in a couple of cities beyond the boundaries of Moscow. Primarily, it was other people who were involved. In Moscow, yes, it was overcrowded. Okay, next.
Okay, so as a bit of a segue and follow-up to that, perhaps, as I was making my Seder in my home this year and preparing for this and the other programs, one thing that I realized in opposition, if you will, to all of your experience, is that the Jews of Egypt were alone. Right? We didn't have social media then. There was no sense, and Egypt was the world power and enslaved millions of us. And it's much for a much deeper conversation as to how Jews existed as Jews, other than in a similar way by being enslaved and isolated and forced into their identity, which is the case of many of you and others. But the difference is all of you and thousands of other Soviet Jews knew that other Jews and Christians were actively involved in advocating for your liberation, from the most powerful world leaders to students like myself and housewives. I love the pejorative way that students and housewives was thrown around then, as if we had no influence. So I wonder if maybe not juxtaposing the Jewish enslavement in Egypt and how they must have been alone, but you weren't alone. And you knew that. So how did that help make a difference? Ephraim, you're here.
Yes, it made a difference. Definitely, we knew we were not alone, and knew that our case, our struggle is shared by our friends, Jewish and non-Jewish alike. It made a huge difference. Let me say that in the most dire circumstances, in the prison, when you're isolated from the world, and know if you ever see the free world, I don't exaggerate, you still know that there are others who share your pain, the others who do not sleep at night, the others that take it close to heart. It's absolutely encouraging, absolutely important. And as I mentioned before, I see this event today as an opportunity again to thank you those who know that I always thank them. I appreciate their help and their sharing of our struggle. And those that I had no opportunity, especially our Christian friends. And after my release from the prison, I was in contact with none less the Secretary of State, George Shultz, was recently participated in a tribute event. And that's sort of a person that you would not expect any human, feelings. Indeed, radiated warmth and understanding. He took our case personally to deal with his Soviet counterpart, Mr. Shevardnadze. Incredible story, an incredible story. So,
By the way,
thank you very much to all those who helped.
Yeah, I think I'm glad you mentioned George Shultz. Remind me correct if I'm mistaken, do I remember that he hosted a Passover Seder in the US Embassy in Moscow?
That's correct.
Big deal, right?
That's correct. But I met him not there in the other event, the embassy.
Got it. Ira, what about yourself? You nodded. Were
yeah,
you at
I just
that?
I agree with Sasha so much. I just wanted to add that this empathy and solidarity stretched the threads of brotherhood and gave us a lot of strength to survive there. But I wanted to add also that unlike the Jews in Egypt, who left with great difficulties, but at the same time, the Soviet Jews left the USSR in very different periods with very different motivation. And it, kind of challenge also to the process of absorption, the new immigrants in Israel is also, in my view, a very important part of the Exodus, especially in a spiritual side of it. And I just wanted to thank Enid Wurtman, especially who is president here. She helped a lot to hundreds or thousands of new immigrants here in Israel when they were refugees there and after they came to Israel, because it was only the first step of their, exodus. And I also wanted to say that when we made an aliyah finally at 87, as soon as we escaped from the USSR and found ourselves at home in our land, we began to fight for those who were still refugees in the Soviet Union. And my father was among them. He was 13 years refugee. So dozens of organizations all over the world helped us. But I wanted to mention one demonstration in Washington on a cold winter day on Shabbat, when the student struggle for Soviet Jewry and Glenn Richter and Rabbi Avi Weiss organized this demonstration, and they paid for the hotel. We couldn't do it then. They rented a place near the demonstration site, and we were accompanied by a Christian woman who wanted to help our struggle. She knew that we couldn't carry objects on Shabbat and carried the Torah scroll for us to this demonstration place. Seeing that I was very, very cold, she gave me her woolen sweater. It's been 35 years and I cannot forget it. I would very much like to tell her thank you again. Unfortunately, I don't know where she is, and maybe somebody could help me to find her.
Maybe stranger things have happened with people reconnecting. So maybe this will be broadcast, and we'll find the woman who was so
kind for
helpful.
us.
Right. I've lost. Lisa, do you remember? You said your parents' houses were full and you had lots of visitors. Again, you came from a different perspective as a child. Did that give you encouragement? Did it help you? Did you have hope in the Exodus story that this was? I think Ephraim said that it was you almost a detachment from reality. Did you feel that was something that was at some point imminent?
I would like to maybe tell another little piece of puzzle of from a child perspective. I was nearing my bat mitzvah time, and I don't think there was a practice of having bat mitzvahs then, but maybe more bar mitzvahs in Russia. But still, I had a lot of letters from girls all over the States and Israel who had their bat mitzvah a year, and they chose to be in touch with a refugee child. And I, as Ira already thanked Enid, I want to mention that Enid told me also about her sons having bar mitzvah twins, and her actually organizing more and more families to do it. So it's something to be very thankful for. And I know that as the girls that I received their letters and wrote them back, that there were many more letters that I never received because of the censorship. And as you said in the beginning of our talk tonight, that you sent many letters, there are also a lot of Jewish kids wrote to me and other children, and this gave me I think a feeling of being part of something of a bigger community, and it made me very hopeful, and made me actually feel that there is actually a world beyond the Soviet Union, because we would be talking about it, but
Sure.
Unless as a child, I think the hearing from another Jewish children was something else than seeing adults meeting another adults.
Nice.
And that was something very, very meaningful for me.
Great perspective. Thank you.
Yeah, the same here. I would like to add. I had a bar mitzvah with many bnai mitzvahs, meaning when you have a bar mitzvah, you're 13-year-old. You're becoming an adult in the Jewish tradition. So American kids made this bnai mitzvah, meaning that they had a place in the synagogue together with me. And there is one guy who we are still in touch with. So maybe it's like amazing. It's 40 years already. When I left the Soviet Union and came to the States, I think a year after, we had a picture at the very same place in the synagogue when
Wow.
there was, the original picture when he's standing with a prayer book, Jewish prayer book, and my kippah, my yarmulke, and prayer book on the next place. And I think 20 years later, we were staying at the same place, but I am carrying this prayer book. and I'm wearing this yarmulke that he had 20 years ago.
Nice.
At my Bnei mitzvah, and yeah, this was very, very important and had an enormous impact. This support, and of course, what Ephraim just told about the prison. I mean, it can be compared even to what I felt. I mean, it's not like to be a Bnei mitzvah, but still, it is very. It was very, very meaningful, and this perspective, I think I agree with you, Lisa, very much. To see, to interact with children, and to see a different perspective than to interact with adults, and to see like my parents interact with the adults who came into Russia to support. It was it bring a different angle. And it was very important to
Beautiful.
To us.
I mentioned at the outset of the conversation tonight, in the introduction, it was that 1982 Hadassah magazine article that my mother read sitting at the dinner table about the whole idea of twinning bar and bat mitzvahs, as you just both of you discussed on a personal basis. But I was already, I don't know, 17, way past my bar mitzvah. She was reading it for my younger brother, and I didn't know anything about this. And I felt, strangely, I felt cheated, which is why I jumped in and said, well, how come I didn't have that chance when I was a bar mitzvah? And so I just went and adopted a family with two daughters and struggled to get them out. That's my story, not to go into tonight because you're the guest. But it's so interesting that as you both mentioned your personal experience receiving those letters, for many young people like myself at the time, that was it's something that we could do that was active, that connected us on our side of the history. David, you already mentioned when you came. First of all, before I go into the next question, I want to begin to wrap it up, and I do want to encourage. I do wish eventually this will be posted on Facebook and YouTube. I'm sorry that those who were registered on Facebook were unable to join us, but certainly those who are with us now on Zoom. If you have questions, please use the chat. David, you mentioned earlier about your first experience and the difference here in Israel. When you came to Israel, you had your first Seder. You said, L'shana haba b'Yerushalayim, next year in Jerusalem, and wow, you're here already. Ephraim, I wanted to ask you first or next about that experience. You came here in 1988. I don't recall what month, so I don't know if you celebrated Pesach in 1988 or 89. What was that first experience like?
You know, this experience and the entire story is a story of incredible dreams coming true. The youth that starts thinking of someone detached from reality of going to Israel, contributing to returning to the place where he belongs, to thinking of a possible potential one day in Jerusalem, and coming finally here. It's a double experience. On one part, you are happy to see your dreams come true. The second thought is, so what's next? And the third thought is how to convey this feeling to the next generation, how to make them share our incredible experience. We are taught that in order to understand the full dimension of the liberation, you first need to taste the slavery, and that I tasted. So how do I share that with my kids, with the next generation? It's a big challenge.
Well, that's actually going to be my last question, my formal question that I had. But before we go into that, Ira, you also came here 1987. What was the first Passover in Israel, and how was that different? Obviously, it was different, but how so?
Okay, you know, you may be in Israel and may continue to live as in Egypt. So we saw a lot of pedagogical work with the new immigrants, because it's not you know, it's not a miracle that happens every day that people just come from the plane from Kiev, Moscow, Leningrad, and so on, and they become Jewish, because you know the Soviet authorities tried so hard to make them forget about their Jewishness. It was for 3 generations that they tried to do it, and sometimes they succeeded, unfortunately. That those who come here, they need to you know, to do something with this slavery which prolonged here in Israel. That's why it's so important to work with them here educationally. And I wanted to say that once my American friend told me in half a joke, he said, when we went out on demonstrations for you, it helped a lot to raise the young generation. What a pity that now there are no refuseniks. It was a joke, you know, but in reality, there are a huge number of problems that require our joint intervention in educational field, first of all, in my eyes, in different parts of the world. And some of them are related to the violation of human rights. Some of them, as I mentioned, connected with the new immigrants here. And so I think, Sasha, that there are a lot what to do here now. And I am very proud that my children here in Israel who were born here and my grandchildren asked me very seriously, what is the date of our Aliyah? You know, they feel like it's our Passover, it's our Egypt that we together came from.
That's incredible. So again, I just don't want to belabor it. I'm posting, and I'd love for people to ask their questions. I'm looking at some of the questions that I received beforehand and trying to interweave them in our conversation today. But I think that if there are no more questions, this is sort of a great penultimate place to begin to conclude. First of all, Ira, fascinating concepts as to what needs to be done, and there certainly is truth to that joke, because I'm living proof of it from my end, that wasn't the only thing that engaged me in Jewish life in America. And David, you and I always had that debate: who's the bigger hero? You for resisting and being a Jew in the Soviet Union, or for me making choices that could have included you or not, growing up in New Jersey. Very different, and those are for other conversations. But now you're here. Now you have children. Everyone's got children. 2 of you have grandchildren. We've got, I think, if I remember by count what you told me, 30 plus children and grandchildren here among us. As far as the next generations. Now, during Pesach and the Seder specifically, it's very child-centric. We are imparting our history and the lessons and telling the story because our children ask the questions, and because and we do that with lots of symbolism that's earmarked to the children. So how do we can go on this point philosophically, broadly, or we can go personally. But I'd love to know, in your individual cases, and I'm thrilled. So people are posting that Ira's Aliyah was in November of '88 and Lisa in August of '87. Sorry, I didn't have a chance to visit you in Leningrad in October of '87. I'm sure we would have had a lot of fun together. What do you do? How do you, in your own families, continue that tradition? And I love that you just said that your own children and grandchildren are saying, what was the date of our Aliyah? I love that. So maybe Ira, do you want to pick up on that thought?
Me also, my kids are asking, I think during Seders several years ago, when they were kids. Really, today they are grown-ups. I have 4 kids. Two of them are big boys already married. But when they were boys, they told me that it's great that they are raised in a refusnik family, though they haven't been raised in a refusnik family. They haven't been raised. All of them were born in Israel. Um, but for them, it was much more meaningful when their parents told them about their aliyah, about their exodus, and it was much more real for them to understand what Passover means. And they many times they told me that in spite of the fact that they take their freedom for granted, it cannot be the other way when you are born in the free country, right? But still, they are saying that it helps them to understand better what freedom means when they know the story of their parents and their grandparents.
Thanks. Ira, you were speaking before you began to speak?
I just wanted to say that even in the former Soviet Union, the young generation don't know anything about the refuseniks. When I asked who the refusnik were in the Jewish school in Ukraine, one boy told me that they are the children which mother didn't want to take them from the hospital after their birth. You know, because now in Russian, this word refusnik has another meaning. They don't know anything about this part of our Jewish history. And I think it's a pity, and we should teach it, and we should ourselves learn something from this story. And our family, we make in the Day of Jerusalem, it's the day we left Moscow in '87. We make another our family party every year, and all the children are coming from the different part of the country, and it is our Aliyah Day, even those who were born here. And that's why we in Mahanaim, we created Mahanaim to enable Jews, you know, from the USSR to meet their Jewry and their land, and to meet people from different countries, to meet different opinions, and to build our common goals and objectives here and all over the world.
I look forward to continuing that conversation with you and being part of that. By the way, we also celebrate August 4th as our Aliyah Day. And of course, Jews coming home to Israel is significant for all of us, but I don't think my choice to get on an airplane at Kennedy Airport and bring 5 children, as dramatic as that was in August of 2004, is as significant, at least to the Exodus story that we're speaking about, as all of you. Ephraim, I see you've unmuted and are ready to jump in about how you're imparting this to your children and grandchildren.
Yes, first we also have our Aliyah Day. We basically have one family reunion celebrating my release from the prison and our Aliyah Day. It's 2 close dates, so it's other part of the year. But going back to the 2 subjects, important subjects that Ira mentioned, this story has been generally forgotten, whatsoever erased from the collective memory. And it's definitely our duty to try to revive it. It's absolutely necessary, because it's ingratitude to forget the divine force that again helped us, and the help of all others, human beings throughout the world that were involved. That first thing. In our family, we we share it with children each time during the narration. I recall this story, and everyone feels the part of it. There is a book that they want me to read in Russian, or sometimes they read in Hebrew. Hopefully, it will be in English. So that's the necessary contribution. It's very important to prevent that from fading away, the story. I think that everyone that is participating in this event should do their best to prevent it. At least I'm doing it in my family, and I prepared some materials for a website, and I'm invited to lecture in different places, which I do. It's not enough, I understand, but at least that small contribution. Thank you.
Well, I hope, thank you. I hope that this is a catalyst for us to do that, because it is a generation later. And David, you said it's easy for our children here, to take for granted what we have, and we can't let this part of our history. It's your history personally, our history as a collective. I do want to acknowledge Glenn Richter, who's watching, and I feel humbled, Glenn, that you're with us, and so grateful. I'll never forget the first time I came to your office in New York, and you briefed me for my first trip in '85. Glenn suggesting that people look for the movie Refusnik on Amazon Prime Video. So I certainly, Glenn asked me to suggest. And I would say that I think that there's probably nothing that Glenn would suggest that I would say no to. So Glenn, I'm grateful for that, and all you've done and all you continue to do. David, you unmuted yourself. Did you want to add something? No,
Can
nothing.
I
Okay.
add something?
Yes, please.
Good. So I wanted to first of all say that as I have 3 daughters born in Israel, obviously, since I'm here since teenagers, and also my spouse is also from former USSR, but he is not from a refusnik family, and we do have a lot of talking about the history of our families, and our daughters interviewed our parents and asked them for all kinds of school projects about their history. And we also, during a few family seders, we asked the grandparents to tell their stories, which made actually very, very important impact. But also as a high school teacher, I have a privilege to talk about it with my students. And I want to say that the Enid took part 2 years ago in a project, the whole day that we had with a few activists from Israel, former activists on both sides, an Israeli or American side and a refusnik side. And we had a day of actually interviews and talks and meetings for our students with the guests. And it was a very, very important day, because we already teach a little about this story in the schools, but it's not enough. It's just a little piece, and this was something more important and larger. And I actually want to make a whole study plan about refusniks and Russian Jewry as a history project, and I hope it will actually work out next year. And I think it's something that interests very much Israeli high school students, and it's something they don't know anything about.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I know that I feel sad, because I feel not just among friends, but family. And I'm so grateful again for the 4 of you for joining this conversation today. Obviously for Enid, who reconnected me with Ephraim and introduced me to Ira and Lisa as well. I'm just now putting in the chat for anyone who has questions before we wrap up. We could go all night. We could, just like a Seder, we can go until 1 or 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning. We won't do that now, but I welcome everybody's feedback on this program to see where we continue the conversation. I think it's important. There is a question. I know religion was outlawed in Russia, so are you all Orthodox now? And if not, what's your religious affiliation? Great question. Anyone would like to jump in?
I'm modern Orthodox.
Modern Orthodox.
I'm not Orthodox, but I'm traditional, meaning that we celebrate all Jewish holidays, and we celebrate Shabbat. We do not observe Shabbat, meaning we can drive or switch on the light, but we do have the Friday night meal with prayer, and Saturday night it's called Havdalah, meaning distinguish from Shabbat to the rest of the week.
Very nice. Ira, you're already unmuted.
We became religious in Moscow, which was very challenging. You know, I told you already that we came to study Bible, and the Bible was the main source for values for us. And so the commandments were commandments for us. And it was kind of miracle that happened to some of us. You know, there were a lot of people like me in the USSR, and many of them disappeared as Jews and got lost in the Soviet reality. Some of them tried their best to hide their Jewishness because they suffered from anti-Semitism. And I think that only the Bible way, which brought us to be religious there, could save us as Jews in the Soviet situation. You know, in Egypt also, not all the Jews came out of Egypt. And so it was in the Soviet Union, unfortunately.
Right. Excellent point. Thank you. So there was one last question. Ira, I know you've been back. David, you've been back. There's a question about the current situation for Jews in Russia. Is persecution increased? I would add to that, perhaps, is there any kind of future for Jewish life in Russia? Anyone have any thoughts or input on that?
I'm dealing with the Jewish schools in the former Soviet Union, you know, on the daily basis. So I think that it is very important to prolong with this. More than that, for me, it's kind of tikkun, how you say tikkun.
Repair.
You know, to come there and to make those things that were prohibited when we lived there, to make it openly, and to teach Jewish kids Bible and so on. But I think that the place of Jewish people is here in Israel, and so thank you very much for help Jews home.
Yes.
I think
Right.
we need to understand that there was a major challenge for the authorities to have more than 2 million Jews there. They would prevent them from being Jews and living the country. Now the amount of Jews is much less important, and there's simply no that dimension. So that explains partly why it ceased to be a question.
Good question. David or Liza, do you have any? David, I know you've been back to the Soviet Union, former Soviet Union. Do you have any observations?
Yeah, I've been. I'm traveling to Russia for business. Frankly speaking, I absolutely agree with Ephraim. There are not so many Jews left. So as far as I know, maybe Ira has a different experience. Those who live there, I don't think they are persecuted. But on the other hand, I'm not sure how related to religion or to their Jewishness. They are, maybe some of them, yes. As far as I know, it's not a big deal today to be a Jew on one hand, but on the other hand, there is not much bringing them to be Jews. So, as I'm saying, when I meet Jews in Russia or outside Israel, I'm saying the best place to be a Jew is Israel.
Yes, it is. Yes, it is. Friends, I want to wrap up. First of all, thank you. This has been a delight to make some new friends, reconnect with old friends. And David, you and I are long overdue for a visit. Maybe now that we're vaccinated, we can do that soon. I'd like to introduce another good friend, Pastor George Morrison. He's joining us from Atlanta tonight, where he's retired, but he's retired from his position as former senior pastor at Faith Bible Chapel in the Denver area. I've known George for a number of years. He's hosted in his church any number of times, Nights to Honor Israel. I almost made it to one once, but my travel schedule didn't permit in the end. He is one of the early founders and board members of Kufi, Christians United for Israel. And we've been good friends for a number of years, but one of the things that I love about him is that he's represents from the Christian perspective what I try to represent from a Jewish perspective in terms of building bridges. And even though he's officially retired from pastoring the church, he is active in terms of building bridges and bringing Christians here to Israel to develop those meaningful connections. Some years ago, I don't even remember how, in passing, I was speaking with Pastor George perhaps about my personal experience, and he told me, which surprised me at the time, oh yeah, he was involved. And Pastor George, first of all, thank you for taking the time and joining us today. Would you care, before we close out with prayer and then just some announcements, would you care to offer any comment or any personal observations from today and how this relates back to your experiences working on behalf of Soviet Jews?
Thank you, Jonathan. Yes, first of all, let me say thank you to all our panelists. This was a great time to spend with you by way of this means of communication. I personally wish I were in Israel so that we could have had an in-person get-together, and maybe someday we'll be able to do that again. But thank you, very informative, very helpful. Jonathan, thank you for putting it together. Thanks, Genesis 1, 2, 3, for all your work and all that you're doing to continue to promote Christian-Jewish relationship, but also to, in an educational way, inform people of what really is going on as represented by this particular time we've had together, and the other things that you're doing this week. Our family celebrated the Seder and Passover, and we had a wonderful time. I was with my grandchildren, my 4 youngest grandchildren, and a family that traveled down from Denver to Atlanta that have 4 children. So our house was filled, our tables were full, and we had great discussion on the Exodus and the first Passover and what it means today. So very meaningful for us. Once again, we do this every year, and it's just a reminder to us. So I would like to say before I pray that Genesis and Jonathan and all that you're doing is well worth supporting. And so any of you that are listening right now, any of my Christian friends or anyone else that might hear this, I would say this is a good place to put your seed money because Jonathan continues to continue to reach out, and I think totally open to whatever he can do to promote these relationships that we just talked about, and promote these educational webinars or whatever other means that you're using. Jonathan, thank you, Jonathan, for that. So we will be sending some support for this. And I encourage anyone else who's listening to also do that. I was reminded of a scripture in Jeremiah chapter 16 and verse 14. And let me read it. I'll read it in English because I don't know how to do it in Hebrew. In English, it reads in verse 14, and I'll get to it in 1 second. Let's see, 14, excuse me for the delaying the time. I had it up, but then I'm looking at too many devices at the same time. Behold, the days are coming, declares the Lord, when it shall no longer be said, as the Lord lives, who brought up the people of Israel out of the land of Egypt, but as the Lord lives, who brought up the people of Israel out of the north country, and out of all the countries where he had driven them. For I will bring them back to their own land that I gave to their fathers. What an encouraging portion of scripture for all of us. And it's encouraging in this way. God is faithful. And to me as a Christian, when I look at the faithfulness of God in performing what he did in deliverance of the children of Israel from Egypt, what he did in deliverance of the children of Israel, even from the north countries and from the other countries, for the reestablishment of the nation of Israel as promised in God's word, for reestablishing the city of Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. And I'm so grateful the United States has taken lead in setting up our embassy there. All of these things are a reminder to me that God is faithful and will continue to be faithful. So my prayer, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, that he will continue to be faithful to each and every one of you, each and every one of our listeners, each and every one that not only will be listening to these words by whatever means, but I pray for Israel. I pray for the peace of Jerusalem. I pray that all Jewish people from anywhere in the world, as they choose, will find a resting place in the nation of Israel, but also a resting place in the arms of the faithful God that they serve. Amen.
Amen. Thank you. Thank you, Pastor George. It's hard to follow all of this with something as mundane as announcements, but actually, Pastor George, you set it up. First of all, thank you for your support, your graciousness and generosity in joining us. Anyone who wants more information or to make a donation can go to genesis123.co, and we welcome that. I love everyone's feedback. I didn't know that you hosted a Seder this week as well, and that brings to the final point, is that tomorrow, same time, 9 p.m. is Israel, 2 p.m. Eastern, 11 a.m. Western, and assorted times throughout the rest of the world, we will be hosting our final webinar as part of the Global Passover Prayer for Israel, speaking exactly about that, the phenomena and the growing popularity of Christians celebrating Passover and why that is. And honestly, when we set that up a few weeks ago, I didn't realize myself how deep-seated it is among many of our Christian friends. So I certainly invite you to join us back tomorrow. Hopefully we'll have resolved the sharing on social media and more people can interact with us live, but that's a really important thing. Thanks really doesn't say it sufficiently, but thank you to everybody who's participated, our guests, panelists, Pastor George, Glenn Richter, Enid Wertman, Frank Brodsky, who are here. I think Jeff Stern might still be here. These are all people who, in their own different ways, were really super involved and inspiring hands of God in making this happen. So I'm grateful for everyone being here with us today, and I wish everybody, wherever you are, a joyous completion of your Passover holiday, and look forward to seeing you again. God bless you all.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you. Happy Passover.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you
Hag
all.
Sameach.
Thank you, Jonathan,
Thank you.
for,
Thank you very much.
Thank you,
Thank you.
Jonathan.
Appreciate
for organizing this amazing meeting.
And thank you,
Appreciate it.
Chaim, Ira, and David, for your
Thank you.
stories.
Thank you.
Yeah.
My pleasure. My pleasure.
Good night, everybody. Thank you.
Frank, Enid, Glenn, it was great to see you here.